Hey everybody, Trey here. Welcome back to another video. Today we have a pretty robust severe weather event on tap as the SPC has outlined a level 4 out of 5 moderate risk in the red shaded region you see here, surrounded by a large enhanced level 3 out of 5 and large slight risk level 2 out of 5 that extends all the way back into west central Montana down into the Midwest. But again, that enhanced risk and of course the moderate risk are going to be your greatest threat for severe weather for today. Let's zoom in a little bit here and take a look at some of the hazards. The reason for the moderate risk is significant damaging wind. We have a 45% hatched area in the pink stippled region you see there. So places like Aberdeen, Redfield, Watertown, Brookings, South Dakota, into southwest Minnesota, under the gun for that greatest threat for robust damaging winds, damaging straight line winds today, surrounded by a large 30% hatched area all the way back into northwest South Dakota, into the southern half of Minnesota, northern Iowa. So pretty pervasive threat for significant straight line damaging winds today, and we'll go over some reasons why here in just a bit. Tornado threat is elevated as well, 5% risk in the brown shading there. So basically the Gettysburg, South Dakota area eastward toward the Watertown, Brookings, Sioux Falls area. Mitchell included in that, as is Aberdeen, into southwest Minnesota, surrounded by a 2%. And then large hail is going to be a threat as well, although the significant damaging wind threat should take the cake today as far as the severe threats go. Perhaps a few tornadoes as well, but large hail may be occurring in some of these storms later on today. So let's go ahead and get started here. Let's show you what's going on right now. I'm recording this just after 10 a.m. Central Daylight Time, and we have a complex of storms that has already been ongoing this morning for the past few hours. You see this complex of storms moving across Montana into North Dakota, moving off to the east ever so slowly this morning. That should continue into the afternoon. Models differ on how persistent this convection will be. Will it persist into the afternoon? Will it kind of die off here over the next few hours? A little bit difficult to tell. Looks like it might be starting to lose a little bit of steam here, especially across northern portions of this complex. The northern half of North Dakota looks to be losing a little bit of steam there in some of the reflectivity returns up there. We do see another batch of storms back there across Montana developing this morning. So interesting to see how this plays out. Shouldn't be too much of an impact on our overall setup for this afternoon outside of the outflow effects from this convection. Could we see an outflow boundary setting up across parts of the north central portion of South Dakota? As we saw yesterday, we know that that can be very, very favorable for supercell development, including tornadic supercell development. So we'll have to wait and see how that plays out going into the afternoon. The models are a little bit all over the place as far as how they handle this. We'll take a look at that towards the end of the video. But overall, we do have some pretty robust convection moving across North Dakota and Montana this morning. A severe thunderstorm watch does cover this activity for this morning. We'll see if they extend it further off to the east into the eastern portions of North Dakota and northwest Minnesota with time, but it's just going to be a wait and see deal with how this plays out. But again, our main threat is going to be to the south of this area going into the afternoon. Let's take a look at the overall environment. So this is the SPC mesoanalysis page, the 500 millibar map, and this is a classic summertime pattern. Expansive ridge here across the southern 2/3 of the U.S. The center of that ridge, probably somewhere there in the Arkansas, eastern Oklahoma vicinity, with a nice clockwise flow surrounding that high pressure center. So a very, very expansive ridge here that has taken shape across the southern 2/3 of the country. And over top of that, we have a little bit of enhanced flow and a few little waves moving across atop the ridge in this colloquial ring of fire setup. This is a very common setup for this time of year, and it is exactly what we're going to see today. You see a little bit of subtle troughing here across parts of Canada into the northern plains, a little bit of a subtle shortwave there across North Dakota at this point, likely helping to allow those thunderstorms to persist this morning across North Dakota. And that should continue to kind of flatten the ridge just a little bit up here out across the South Dakota, Minnesota vicinity, and should allow for thunderstorm development later on in the afternoon with that subtle forcing overspreading the region. But again, a classic setup, westerly to northwesterly flow aloft, and this is a textbook setup for significant damaging complexes of thunderstorms with significant damaging wind potential, including the threat for derechos. This ring of fire setup And northwest flow overall this time of year dominates the derecho climatology, and these northwest flow events are very, very efficient at producing significant MCSs, including the threat for derechos. And today, the atmosphere could be enough and long-lasting enough that the overlap of favorable ingredients looks to be long-lasting enough to maybe foster derecho potential going into this evening. So that is going to be the 500 millibar map. Let's go down to the surface right now. So not a ton going on here at the surface. We do see a little bit of a low here just north of the Great Lakes region, and a little bit of a broad cyclone here out across the central high plains. A little bit of a fairly weak broad cyclone there, but a cyclone nonetheless, providing some southerly flow on the east side of that. Warm frontal zone looks like it's located somewhere up in here out across South Dakota into Minnesota, and your low kind of centered there in northeast Colorado. So that warm frontal boundary may lift off to the north a little bit today, and that may be a focus for initial thunderstorm development. Again, we'll have to see how this complex across North Dakota factors into where that warm front is positioned later on, as that outflow from this convective complex could reinforce that warm front a little bit farther south, a little bit farther north, depending on how this progresses through the morning. If it dies off through the morning, outflow may not be as pervasive, may allow that warm front to get a little bit farther north. But if this complex kind of persists into the afternoon, especially if it persists a little bit farther south than expected, then we could see the overall area end up a little bit farther to the south than what was expected. But overall, should see plenty of southerly flow here to pump that moisture up into this eastern South Dakota, Minnesota vicinity for our afternoon round of thunderstorms. 850 millibar map here for our low-level jet. Not a ton going on, as we would expect. We don't have a big trough traversing the Rockies, so we don't really have a low-level cyclone that is set to really tighten today. We do have that weak surface low, weak low-level cyclone, a little bit of just weak troughing here out across the central high plains, allowing for a slightly enhanced flow, about 30 knots there across Nebraska and South Dakota. Would expect that we're going to see a little bit of that waning through the day. And overall, not going to have a ton of low-level flow here until the evening. And when that low-level jet ramps up, it should be fairly favorable in increasing convective coverage, especially with our initiating boundary here quite perpendicular to the overall low-level flow. So that's going to lead to a lot of forcing along that boundary, lots of updrafts able to go up, and then we should see pretty rapid transition to an intense squall line this evening. And the environment should be favorable for significant damaging wind gusts with that squall line. So here is our raw surface data here this morning. So you see where that low level, that surface low is somewhere here in the northeast Colorado, southwest Nebraska vicinity. See the counterclockwise rotation of the wind barbs there around that low center, somewhere in that vicinity there, that far northeast corner of Colorado. We do see a little bit of a frontal boundary, it looks like, right in here, perhaps our warm front. Draped back down to the south toward the surface low center there in northeast Colorado. A little bit tough to tell. We have had an overnight MCS that has kind of overturned the environment up here out across Minnesota, Iowa, into the Dakotas. So it's been a little bit difficult to ascertain things at the surface this morning, but we should see that change going into the afternoon. We should see a more well-defined surface pattern going into the afternoon. That surface low is going to stay there. Our frontal zones will tighten, and we'll see a nice warming and moistening of the warm sector here to the south of the warm frontal zone. Again, somewhere in this vicinity here, where outflow probably pushes that to the south a little bit. But overall, we'll just have to wait and see where that ends up. But we should have robust moisture to the south of that, dew points in the upper 60s to 70s across a broad swath of Nebraska into Iowa. That will shift off to the north a little bit today. Rapid return of moisture, and with skies fairly clear to the south of our ongoing MCS. You see here our ongoing complex of storms here across North Dakota and Montana. You see clear skies off to the south should allow for those temperatures to rise pretty rapidly, lapse rates to steepen, and we should have the ability for a very unstable environment by this afternoon, very explosive convective development possible here by this afternoon. So plenty of juice in the environment to promote robust storm development this afternoon. Here's the 12Z Aberdeen, South Dakota sounding. So this is in far northeast South Dakota, just on the northern edge of that enhanced wind risk there and that moderate risk. So this is right in the middle of our potential area of concern for today. So you see here what we have going on, 66 over 65 at the surface here at 12Z. Quite a bit of dry air here in the low levels. We should again see that change as we go into the afternoon. Should see a little bit of low-level moistening here to allow for a nice low-level environment for robust storm development, but we could maintain some of that drier air aloft, which could allow for a little bit of stronger downdrafts going on into the afternoon today, afternoon and evening. With that little bit of drier air tends to lead to more evaporative cooling, and evaporative cooling leads to an acceleration of the downdraft. So that is one factor that is going to perhaps allow for a little bit more intense downdraft winds out of these storms and the eventual complex this evening. We already have quite a bit of instability in place, about 1,000 joules per kilogram mixed layer CAPE, 1,400 joules per kilogram at most unstable CAPE here. So quite a bit of instability already in place, rooted above this pretty stout capping inversion here between about 850 and 700 millibars. So quite a bit of instability in place. That cap is expected to erode as we get robust surface heating into the afternoon and moistening as well in the low levels, as well as a continued steepening of the lapse rates. Lapse rates very steep already. That mid-level lapse rate there at about 8 degrees Celsius per kilometer, 8.7 there average in that layer between about 700 and 500 millibars or so. Perhaps some semblance of an elevated mixed layer there as well, drifting off over this region to allow for instability to continue to build. Going into the afternoon, we should keep skies free and clear of convection as well to the south of this ongoing complex. Should see clear skies going into the afternoon, allowing for full destabilization and rapid air mass recovery after yesterday's storms. We should see quite a bit of instability developing. Wind shear, not a problem as well. Effective bulk shear at about 52 knots. That should maintain itself as that belt of stronger flow aloft persists across the region today, as and that subtle shortwave, as it impinges across the region, into the region, should see that deep layer shear maintain itself for organized convection. Initial supercells should be fairly likely, and then a transition to an organized MCS after that. You see photographs fairly lengthy here, not a ton of low-level shear, given that fairly weak low-level jet at this point that should persist into the afternoon. Should see mostly a fairly weak low-level wind profile, so not seeing a huge tornado risk with these storms today, but certainly through storm interactions and anything along that boundary. Again, outflow going to play a role here near that boundary. If we do see a robust outflow, wherever that kind of sets up, that could be an area of interest for perhaps a slightly higher chance for a tornado or two with these supercells, but should be a large hail risk, given very steep lapse rates near the freezing level there and instability near that freezing level, and should see a damaging wind risk today, given organized convection and some drier air aloft, allowing for accelerated downdrafts down to the surface. And as outflow congeals that outflow, those winds should be intense as well. So profiles there for organized severe weather today, given strong instability, strong deep layer shear in place and expected to persist into the afternoon. All right, let's take a look at some model data here. This is the 12Z NAM at 500 millibars. Here is our ridge right there across the southern two-thirds of the U.S. Very stout ridge here. And that is going to flatten a little bit up here across the plains, or has been flattened a little bit already with these little shortwave passages, and another one is expected today. You see a little bit of troughing here across Canada, just some broad long wave troughing here, nothing too focused, but we do see that subtle forcing going to persist across the northern plains this afternoon. Very, very, very subtle shortwave here with some enhanced flow associated with that shortwave moving across the Dakotas and Minnesota going into the afternoon. This is at 0Z, so 7 p.m. Central Daylight Time today. Should be just enough forcing to allow for robust storm development this afternoon, especially with robust instability in play. You can see the shortwave a little bit better at 700 millibars. It's emanating here out of the northern high plains. A little bit of a shortwave there. You see the kinks in the height contours. We get that to move off to the east with time. This is 21Z, so 4 p.m. Central, and a little bit of shortwave there starting to impinge upon into central North Dakota, western South Dakota. Ahead of that should be our favored area for storm initiation. So well-defined little shortwave there, subtle but well-defined, and that is going to be enough forcing to allow for storms to develop this afternoon over top of that ridge. Down to the surface, let's go ahead and zoom in here to our central and northern plains sector. So here is that broad cyclone centered somewhere in northeast Colorado this morning. Broad cyclone, not expected to deepen a ton, but should persist going into the afternoon. And we should, as you see those frontal zones tighten. The NAM has the warm frontal zone kind of right in this vicinity here, a little bit farther south than maybe you might think at first glance, but the warm front kind of right in there. You see the wind shift, northeasterly winds on the north side, southerly flow on the south side, clear wind shift, clear pressure tongue there, the kinks in the surface isobars here, indicating exactly where that surface low is going to develop. We do see the pressure gradient does kind of tighten up here as well. So we do perhaps see a slight deepening of the surface low going into the afternoon and a tightening of that warm front. Again, outflow going to play a role here. Perhaps if that complex persists farther into the afternoon, a little bit farther south than expected, could be a role in reinforcing where that warm front ends up. The NAM has it here kind of in eastern South Dakota, and so that should be a favored zone for initiation as that shortwave pivots through. Going into the afternoon, storm should form along that warm frontal zone. Initially, chance to be discreet is there with the threat for all severe hazards, especially along that boundary where low-level shear is maximized. But as the low-level jet ramps up going into the evening hours, we should see more and more storms start to develop. I'll show you here the 850 millibar map you see. Going into the afternoon, we kind of see a waning of the overall low-level jet, and then going into the evening, a little bit of a ramp up there, slight ramp up, ever so slight ramp up. So we should see, again, with the front there, you see those winds kind of perpendicular to that frontal zone, should lead to quite a bit of convective development there. As that warm moist flow interacts with the warm front, should see a lot of storms develop. Outflows are going to congeal, and we should see things get a little bit more intense as far as convective coverage goes this evening. So here is our moisture. You see the atmosphere has been worked over a little bit going into this morning. You see those 70s dew points have been shunted down towards southern Nebraska, eastern Kansas, Missouri. To the north of that, much lower dew points out across that area. That is the overnight complex doing its work to overturn the atmosphere a little bit. But as you see, with that surface low starting to tighten a little bit, that warm front starting to become more well-defined, southerly flow on the east side of that surface low will pump this moisture back up into the region very rapidly. Should not have any issues getting those 70s dew points back up into eastern South Dakota, near and south of that warm frontal zone. So by 21Z here, we should see a robust environment in place to support storm development there across central and eastern portions of South Dakota along the frontal zone. So here is a sounding from eastern South Dakota near that warm front. Very strong instability in place, 4,000 joules per kilogram mixed layer CAPE as progged by the NAM, 94/71 at the surface. So we know the NAM has a tendency to be a little bit too cool, so we could see temperatures up closer to 100 up there with dew points in the 70s. So even though the moisture at first glance, the dew points are high at first glance, we're still going to have fairly high temperature dew point spreads today. If those temperatures get at least into the mid to upper 90s, that's going to lead to temperature dew point spreads in the mid to upper 20s. You see that little bit of an inverted V profile there in the low levels as well. Very steep low-level lapse rates, very warm surface temperatures. That should allow for also a chance for more evaporative cooling and stronger outflow production, given slightly higher temperature dew point spreads. A little bit of drier air aloft as well, associated with perhaps that elevated mixed layer. Very steep lapse rates aloft, approaching 9 degrees Celsius per kilometer in that layer. So very strong instability near that freezing level could promote some large to very large hail with some of the initial supercells. And overall strong deep layer instability should allow for robust explosive storm development later on in the afternoon. And as far as shear goes, again, not going to be a problem today. Approaching 50 knots of effective bulk shear, lengthy hodographs. Low-level shear a bit on the weak side here. You do see a little bit of curvature in the lowest couple kilometers of that hodograph. But overall, the low-level winds are fairly unidirectional there as progged by the NAM here, mostly out of the south up to the lowest couple kilometers there. So not a ton of low-level shear to support a tornado risk, especially with this higher temperature dew point spread. Not a very high tornado risk today, perhaps right along that frontal zone / outflow. Could be where the tornado risk is maximized, but we should see storms that outflow will congeal, and we should see storms congeal into an MCS before any robust tornado risk is realized. A little bit farther off to the west, a little bit stronger capping here as progged by the NAM, 97/70, but still very strong instability, 4,600 joules per kilogram mixed layer CAPE inverted V profile there in the low levels should lead to more outflow dominant supercells today, with a threat for large to very large hail and damaging winds, given very steep lapse rates aloft and that slightly drier low to mid-level profile. So that's at 21Z, 0Z here. We'll take a sounding there across eastern South Dakota, see how the environment progresses going into the early evening. And you see not much change here. Very strong instability. A little bit stronger low-level shear, maybe this might be just north of the frontal zone here. So let me go just a little bit south of that, closer to that Mitchell, South Dakota area in southeast South Dakota. And you see not a ton of low-level shear here. That low-level jet not going to ramp up significantly, enough to probably increase coverage of storms going into the evening. But overall, should not be a real robust tornado risk today outside of very much any storm along that warm frontal zone / outflow boundary. But even then, spreads are going to be a little bit on the high side. So more of an outflow dominant supercell mode is probable today, leading to upscale growth fairly quickly. Going into the evening, you see those 70s dew points get eaten out there by the potential MCS. So it'll have plenty of fuel to feed on. You see a long swath here of 70s dew points going off toward the southeast where that MCS is going to travel. And so a very spatially expansive set of ingredients here today to allow for a long-lasting severe threat going into the nighttime and overnight hours tonight. All right, let's take a look at some convection allowing models here today. So this is the 12Z HRRR, and you see how it has tried to model the ongoing convection here across North Dakota, 1415Z. So recording this here just before 16Z, and you see we're a little bit off here with the depiction of the overall convection going on. This is the HRRR's depiction. This is the current depiction. You see quite a bit stronger complex here farther to the south than what the HRRR has it. So overall, not a great depiction here of the ongoing convection. But again, shouldn't have too much of an impact on the overall environment. It's going to remain well north of our area of interest. Now the HRRR has this activity across western North Dakota becoming robust going into the early afternoon hours today. That is going to be this activity emanating out of Montana. So we'll see if the HRRR is right here with this depiction. That could have impacts on where that frontal zone sets up. But you see by afternoon, we start to see supercells there near that and south of the warm frontal zone across southern South Dakota here on this particular run. And then eventually we see quite a bit of activity into eastern South Dakota, southern Minnesota. And then we see a complex developing much farther east than what the SPC has progged here, mostly across southern Minnesota, northern Iowa into Wisconsin. Not a ton of robust MCS activity out here across South Dakota. So interesting here to see that from the HRRR. We'll see if that comes to fruition. Let's go ahead and take a look at the WRF ARW model. So here is that convection across North Dakota this morning. Again, not really all that far south, not really as far south as what has happened in reality, but it does have quite a bit of convective coverage here lasting into the afternoon and then kind of dying off. And then we see storms along that frontal zone developing by about 22, 23Z, 5 to 6 p.m. there, robust supercells all the way back into western South Dakota. And then we get a pretty quick upscale growth, especially with the eastern portion of that, eastern South Dakota into central and southern Minnesota. Quick upscale growth into a pretty intense complex there. You see a very well-defined MCS with some bowing segments in there. That would be our damaging wind potential. And interestingly, it's again farther off to the east than what the SPC was showing here with their highest wind corridor. So we'll have to wait and see how that plays out. Could see some shifts eastward in this overall moderate risk. The enhanced risk does kind of cover that, but we could see an expansion of that moderate risk perhaps into southern and central Minnesota with the upcoming update here. But overall, robust storms likely going into this afternoon with supercell potential and then a threat for a robust MCS here on the ARW model. Here's the NSSL WRF. So it has that activity, and it has the activity across North Dakota really becoming pervasive going into the afternoon and becoming kind of the main show with some isolated supercell development out ahead of that. And then we get a big old complex to move through eastern South Dakota into southern Minnesota. Very intense MCS there with significant damaging wind potential. So A little bit of a difference among the model solutions, going to depend on how this activity acts going into the afternoon. The NSSL WRF has this kind of becoming the main show, whereas the other models have additional development out here across the South Dakota corridor becoming the main show, and then eventually transitioning into an MCS later on. So the cams are a little bit up in the air this morning, but overall the environment is there for a pretty robust severe weather setup for these areas across the northern plains into the upper Midwest. Again, for now, moderate risk, level 4 out of 5, in the red shading you see there. So that's going to be eastern central, north central to eastern South Dakota, southwest Minnesota. Would not be surprised to see some shifts in the lines, perhaps expansion here into south central Minnesota going into the afternoon outlooks today. But for now, we have an enhanced risk, level 3 out of 5, that extends and covers that risk going all the way up just to the Minneapolis metro, there southwestward from there, including Sioux Falls, Pierre, South Dakota in that level 3 out of 5 risk, and then a slight risk back all the way into Montana for some upslope regime supercells up in there possible, and then all the way down into the Midwest. So we will probably see some shifts in these outlook lines going into our upcoming outlooks as more data comes in. But for now, this is what the SPC has. Again, the reason for the moderate risk is significant damaging winds, straight line damaging winds. In the pink shaded region here that coincides with the moderate risk, that's going to be where for now, the greatest threat for significant straight line winds are going to be. Could see winds in excess of 70, 80 miles per hour with this MCS as it becomes mature this evening. Initial supercells will also have the chance to produce significant damaging outflow winds as well, given high temperature dew point spreads and a slightly drier low to mid-level air mass. But right there in the pink shaded region for now, greatest threat for significant damaging winds, and then the red stippled region, we'll see that significant damaging wind threat as well. And we, again, could see shifts and expansions of that highest wind threat going on into the upcoming outlooks. Tornado risk, fairly low today. They do have a 5% out. Storm interactions and near that warm frontal zone could lead to a few tornadoes, and we could see a few spin-up tornadoes in the line as well as the line becomes mature. But overall, the tornado risk today is going to be fairly low, I think, given slightly higher temperature dew point spreads and some more outflow dominant tendency to the supercells. But we could have enough low-level shear along the outflow boundary for maybe an isolated tornado or two early on in the convective life cycle as the supercells get going, and then a few spin-ups along the line are possible as the MCS and possible derecho move off to the east-southeast this evening. Large hail also going to be a threat today with any supercells that develop before things grow upscale. So very potent severe risk today. Derecho potential certainly heightened depending on how extensive that MCS is, how far it's able to travel. But it does seem likely that initial supercells will develop into an intense MCS with significant damaging wind potential later on in this afternoon and evening. And if it lasts long enough, we could see a derecho by the time things are all said and done. Again, don't take these lines for as being perfect for now. I'm sure we'll see some shifts in the lines, perhaps some expansions of the moderate risk area there going into the next outlook or two. But for now, this is what they have. And anyone in the yellow, orange, or red regions, especially the orange and red regions, should be on high alert today for significant severe weather. Have those weather radios handy, have multiple ways of receiving warnings, and we'll get through this just fine. And just one more thing, straight line winds, not as sexy, so to speak, as tornadoes. You don't have the visuals that tornadoes provide as far as photogenicness, but straight line damaging winds can be just as, if not more damaging than tornadoes. They can be very pervasive as well, whereas tornadoes can be much more localized in their extent of damage. Straight line winds, this complex is going to be quite far-reaching. So a lot of folks are going to be under the gun for significant damaging winds in excess of 80, maybe even 90, 100 miles an hour today. So just because it's a straight line wind threat, don't take it, don't let your guard down. We could see pretty significant damaging winds this evening with that complex. So with that, thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next video. Thank you for watching this forecast discussion. I hope you found it helpful. If you'd like to access more free content, head over to stormchasercoaching.com and click on the free button in the menu. There are ebooks, podcast episodes, and even a free community that you can join to connect with weather enthusiasts and storm chasers just like you. The link is in the description box below. Thanks again for watching.